Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're exploring the expansive history, the demographics, and the modern realities of Native Americans in the United States. This is a story of incredible resilience. It's about complex legal frameworks and a constantly evolving cultural landscape that is just absolutely vital to understanding America today. So, let's jump right into it.
Here's our quick roadmap. First, the demographics of today. Second, deep history and colonization. Third, tribal sovereignty and rights. Fourth, modern challenges and the economy. And finally, culture, identity, and representation. All right, let's kick things off with part one, the demographics of today. So, according to the 2020 census, nearly 10 million people identify as Native American, either alone or in combination with another race. That number reflects a massive demographic rebound over the last century. To put that into perspective, it's almost 3% of the total U.S. population today, and we're seeing major communities really thriving in states like Alaska, Oklahoma, Arizona, and California. Now, this is fascinating because it totally busts those common media stereotypes you might be used to. A staggering 78% of Native Americans actually live off-reservation in urban areas. This shift really picked up speed in the mid-20th century. What that means is, today, cities like Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and Denver are these huge, vibrant hubs of Native American life and culture, while only 22% of the population lives on reservations.
Moving right along to part two, deep history and colonization.
The timeline of Native peoples in North America is just staggering. It begins as far back as 25,000 years ago with Paleo-Indians arriving via Beringia. Fast forward to the year 1250 CE, and indigenous societies had built thriving, massive urban centers like Cahokia, which had a population of over 20,000 people. But, as we know, this long trajectory was violently altered starting in 1492 with European colonization. Over the next few centuries, newly introduced diseases, warfare, and aggressive federal policies fundamentally fractured these societies. We're talking about policies like the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which forced mass relocations, and the 1871 Indian Appropriations Act, which literally ended the recognition of independent Native nations. And honestly, it wasn't even until 1924 that all Native Americans born in the U.S. were finally granted full citizenship. But the crucial takeaway here, and it's a heavy one, is this devastating demographic contrast. We go from a pre-Columbian population that's estimated anywhere from 2 to over 18 million people across the continent, all the way down to a collapse of roughly 600,000 by the end of the 18th century. That catastrophic drop was driven by exposure to new diseases like smallpox, relentless warfare, and systemic ethnic cleansing by settler colonizers.
That brings us to Section 3, Tribal Sovereignty and Rights.
Despite all that structural displacement and historical trauma, Native peoples survived. And in doing so, they've had to navigate a really complex legal relationship with the United States government. This brings us to an absolutely foundational concept if we want to understand modern Native communities: tribal sovereignty. Today, there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. that possess this sovereignty. They act as domestic, dependent nations. Basically, that means they operate largely independent of state law. They form their own governments, they enforce their own civil and criminal laws within their territories, and they even levy taxes.
But, asserting and protecting these rights hasn't been easy. It's required constant struggle. In fact, the fight for indigenous rights intersected deeply with the broader American civil rights movement in the 1960s. This reality is anchored powerfully by Martin Luther King Jr. He collaborated directly with Native activists and wrote very candidly about the nation's dark origins, stating, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race."
Through alliances like these, organizations such as the National Indian Youth Council stood shoulder to shoulder with MLK. During the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, Native leaders marched to passionately demand guaranteed housing, better schools, and, crucially, economic development. But they made one thing very, very clear. They wanted these things on their own terms, totally free from paternalistic federal oversight.
Which leads us straight into part 4, modern challenges and economy.
That demand for economic empowerment on their own terms is at the heart of today's challenges. Now, when most people think of tribal economies, they immediately think casinos, right? And yes, the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act did allow tribes to run gaming operations, and that generated a massive $27 billion annually by 2011. But here is a truly surprising reality. Only 40% of federally recognized tribes actually operate casinos. That leaves 60% relying on other, often much more difficult avenues for economic survival. For those other tribes, researchers at the Harvard Project have pointed out a towering stack of barriers to economic development. We're talking about a severe lack of access to capital, extreme geographical isolation from major markets, endless bureaucratic hurdles, and crippling land ownership rules that make building any kind of business incredibly difficult.
Actually, one of the most complex hurdles here is a concept called fractionalization. Because of historical federal laws, a single parcel of reservation land might be inherited by 50 different heirs over generations without ever being officially subdivided. Imagine trying to build a business or even just a house on that land and needing unanimous agreement from dozens of distant relatives. It makes development practically impossible.
To make matters even tougher, this economic struggle is deeply compounded by a historical process sociologists call colonial ecological violence. It essentially unfolds in three devastating steps. First, native peoples were completely dispossessed of their ancestral lands. Second, those lands were commodified and exploited by settlers. And third, this physical separation actively disrupted and destroyed centuries of deeply rooted indigenous ecological knowledge.
You can really see the real-world impact of this violence when you look at specific examples. Take the Karuk tribe in California. For generations, they used controlled fires to manage their environment and to hunt. But when the Klamath National Forest was established, they were banned from using traditional fire management. That fundamentally disrupted their economy and the local ecosystem. Similarly, the Potawatomi were displaced from 30 million acres in the Great Lakes, and the Miami tribe was forced completely out of Ohio, which cut them off entirely from their traditional culture-affirming resources.
All right, our final section, Part 5, Culture, Identity, and Representation.
So, against all this backdrop of historical displacement and modern economic hurdles, how do Native Americans navigate their identity today? Well, even the terminology itself is super nuanced. The term Native American was introduced in the 1960s to properly recognize the original indigeneity of the people. However, a lot of activists and community members actively reappropriated the term American Indian, feeling it better witnessed the specific history of violence and treaties with the U.S. government. Ultimately, community preferences just vary widely by region, by generation, and by the individual.
We're also seeing a massive, honestly really positive shift in how Native people are represented in broader society. In sports, major franchises like the Washington Commanders and Cleveland Guardians finally retired stereotypical names and mascots. In Hollywood, we've moved from the highly offensive days of white actors in mock attire to groundbreaking, exclusively Native cast and directed films like Smoke Signals. And in the workforce and education, conversations are actively evolving around identity, ensuring affirmative action supports those with genuine cultural and tribal ties rather than just, box checking.
From surviving a pre-colonial population crash to driving today's urban resurgence and leading ongoing battles for self-determination, the story of Native Americans is undeniably one of incredible, enduring resilience. They've fought to retain their cultures, their lands, and their rights against staggering odds. Which leaves us to ask, as these communities continue to grow and assert their legal and cultural independence, how will this ongoing push for sovereignty shape their next chapter? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.